I had been unemployed for exactly 8 months and 12 days when the email arrived in my inbox. My bank account was overdrawn, the eviction notices were piling up on my kitchen counter, and I was skipping meals to make a bag of rice last an entire week. Desperation changes the way your brain processes risk, and when you have absolutely nothing left to lose, red flags just look like ordinary banners waving in the wind. The job offer came from an elite law firm located in a massive black glass skyscraper downtown. I had applied for a generic data entry position through a third party recruiting website weeks ago, entirely forgetting about the application until they contacted me to schedule a midnight interview. I put on my only clean suit and took the late bus into the city center. The building was completely deserted when I arrived. A silent security guard checked my identification and directed me towards a service elevator that only went down. The interview did not take place in a polished boardroom with mahogany tables and leather chairs. It happened in a windowless concrete sub-basement, illuminated by harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights. The man who interviewed me wore an expensive tailored suit that looked entirely out of place in the sterile, dusty environment. He asked me very few questions about my previous work experience. He mainly wanted to know about my personal life. He asked if I lived alone, if I had any close family members nearby, and how well I handled working in complete isolation. I answered honestly, explaining that I was entirely independent and desperately needed a steady income. He offered me the job immediately. The salary he quoted was staggering. It was more money than I had made in the last 3 years combined. My title would be Archival Disposal Technician, and my shift would run from midnight until 8 in the morning. My only responsibility was to operate an industrial room-sized paper shredder to destroy old case files and classified corporate documents. I accepted the position without a second thought. I would have agreed to sweep toxic waste for that kind of money. The man nodded, handed me a heavy brass keycard, and walked me over to a large bulletin board mounted on the concrete wall next to the machine. A single sheet of laminated paper was pinned to the corkboard. "These are the operational guidelines," the man said, his voice flat and completely devoid of emotion. "Read them carefully. Follow them exactly. I will be back at 8 in the morning to relieve you." He turned and walked back to the service elevator. The heavy metal doors slid shut, and the elevator hummed as it ascended, leaving me completely alone in the sprawling, windowless basement. I walked over to the bulletin board to read the guidelines. I expected standard corporate safety warnings about keeping loose clothing away from the moving gears or wearing protective safety glasses. Instead, the laminated sheet contained only four typed sentences. Rule 1. Do not read the contents of the red folders. Rule 2. If the shredder jams and begins to leak a red, viscous fluid, unplug it and face the corner until the humming stops. Rule 3. If you find a photograph of yourself in the pile of documents, shred it immediately without breaking eye contact with it. Rule 4. If you hear someone knocking on the heavy steel elevator doors at 3 in the morning, do not let the door knocker enter the room. I stood there staring at the paper for a long time. The rules made absolutely no logical sense. They sounded like a prank, the kind of hazing ritual older employees used to terrify the new hire on the night shift. I assumed the management team had left the sign there to test my ability to follow instructions without asking questions. Elite corporate firms are notorious for their eccentric paranoia regarding document security and employee compliance. I decided I would simply do exactly what I was paid to do: feed paper into a machine and collect my paycheck. I turned my attention to the shredder. It was a massive piece of industrial equipment, occupying the entire center of the room. A wide rubber conveyor belt sloped upward, leading into a heavy steel hopper where interlocking rows of razor-sharp metal drums waited to grind anything into microscopic confetti. Beside the machine stood dozens of heavy cardboard boxes stacked nearly to the ceiling, all filled to the brim with paperwork. I pressed the heavy green button on the control panel. The machine roared to life, a deep mechanical grinding that vibrated through the concrete floor and rattled my teeth. I grabbed the first box, hauled it over to the conveyor belt, and started grabbing handfuls of manila folders. I tossed them onto the moving rubber belt and watched them travel upward before falling into the metal hopper. The steel teeth caught the paper, pulling the folders down with a violent, tearing crunch. The machine devoured the documents effortlessly, spitting a steady stream of fine white dust into an enormous clear plastic collection bag attached to the exhaust vent. The work was mindless and deeply monotonous. For the first few hours, my mind wandered as my hands automatically grabbed, tossed, and reached for more paper. The isolation of the room was heavy, pressing against my eardrums beneath the roar of the machine. The fluorescent lights buzzed with a steady rhythm. The air smelled strongly of dry paper dust, hot metal, and the faint, bitter scent of machine oil. I was emptying the 14th box of the night when I saw the first anomaly. Mixed in among the standard beige manila folders was a single, brightly colored red folder. The thick cardstock was completely unmarked, lacking any labels, barcodes, or identifying features. I remembered the first rule on the laminated sheet. I grabbed the red folder firmly, intending to toss it directly into the conveyor belt without opening it. My hands were coated in a fine layer of paper dust, making my grip slippery. As I swung my arm toward the belt, the folder slipped from my fingers. It hit the edge of the steel hopper and fell backward, landing flat on the concrete floor near my boots. The impact caused the folder to pop open. A thick stack of loose paper slid out, fanning across the dusty ground. I knelt down to gather the papers, fully intending to shove them back into the folder unread. However, the font on the top page was unusually large, and my eyes instinctively registered the words before I could look away. The document appeared to be a highly detailed clinical autopsy report, or a crime scene analysis. The language was cold and professional, but the subject matter was entirely impossible. It described a murder case where the victim had been completely hollowed out from the inside, their internal organs replaced with tightly compacted ash. Below the text was a detailed, hand-drawn diagram of a creature that defied all known biological logic. The illustration showed a shifting, nebulous shape, composed entirely of dense, intersecting lines. The caption beneath the drawing described a shadowy entity that existed exclusively within two-dimensional spaces, hunting by attaching itself to the cast shadows of human beings. The text explicitly stated a strict containment protocol. Anyone observing the shadow must maintain unbroken eye contact with the entity, or it will immediately detach from the surface and devour the observer's physical body. I gathered the papers quickly, shoving them back into the red folder. I stood up and brushed the dust from my knees. My heart was beating slightly faster, but my rational mind quickly manufactured an explanation. Law firms handle all kinds of intellectual property disputes. I figured the company must represent a major entertainment studio, a video game developer, or a horror author involved in a copyright lawsuit. The files were likely world-building documents, script drafts, or concept art for a fictional project that needed to be securely destroyed. I actually felt a brief wave of embarrassment for letting a fictional monster story startle me in the middle of an empty basement. I tossed the red folder onto the conveyor belt. It traveled upward, reached the edge of the hopper, and dropped down into the spinning steel blades. The heavy metal drum slammed to a sudden, violent halt, sending a powerful shudder through the entire concrete floor. The conveyor belt stopped moving. The deafening roar of the shredder was instantly replaced by a low, struggling, electrical hum. as the motor fought against a massive obstruction. I stepped back, staring at the hopper. A thick, dark red fluid began to ooze upward from between the stationary steel blades. The liquid was thick and viscous, pooling heavily over the jammed gears. It did not look like hydraulic fluid or printer ink. It possessed a dark, rich color and flowed with a heavy consistency that immediately made my stomach turn. Rule number 2 flashed into my mind. If the shredder jams and begins to leak a red, viscous fluid, unplug it and face the corner until the humming stops. I looked at the heavy black power cord plugged into the industrial wall outlet. I looked at the dark corner of the concrete room behind me. Then I thought about my bank account. I thought about the eviction notices on my kitchen counter. I had just been hired for a job that paid an astronomical salary, and within my first few hours, I had managed to break the piece of equipment that likely cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. If I unplugged the machine and stood in the corner like a punished child, the morning supervisor would arrive, see the broken shredder, and fire me immediately. I would be back on the street by noon. I decided I could not afford to follow a bizarre, eccentric rule. I needed to clear the jam, get the machine running again, and clean up the leaking fluid before anyone found out. I stepped up to the edge of the metal hopper and peered down into the blades. The red folder had been completely chewed up, but beneath the shredded red cardstock I saw the true case of the blockage. A thick, dense stack of heavy, glossy photograph paper was wedged tightly between the main grinding drums, preventing them from turning. I reached my hand carefully down into the hopper, avoiding the razor-sharp edges of the stationary blades, and grabbed the edge of the thick stack of photographs. I pulled firmly, wiggling the glossy paper back and forth until it slid free from the teeth of the gears. I pulled the stack out of the machine and held it under the harsh fluorescent light. I wiped a smear of the thick red fluid off the top photograph using my thumb. I stared at the image, and a deep, paralyzing cold washed over my entire body. The photograph showed a young boy standing in the center of a small, messy bedroom. The boy was holding a plastic toy dinosaur and smiling brightly at the camera. The bedroom was completely familiar. The posters on the wall, the patterned bedsheet, the specific shape of the window frame. It was my childhood bedroom. The young boy in the picture was me, roughly 7 years old. I was looking at a photograph of myself that I'd never seen before. My eyes drifted from my smiling childhood face to the background of the image. The bedroom was illuminated by the camera flash, casting a sharp, dark shadow against the painted drywall behind my younger self. The shadow did not belong to a 7-year-old boy. The shadow cast against the wall in the photograph was towering and deformed. It possessed elongated, multi-jointed limbs that reached across the ceiling, and a head that split open into a jagged, toothless maw. It was the exact shape of the shadowy entity depicted in the diagrams of the red folder I had just read. My hands began to tremble violently. I flipped to the next photograph in the stack. It was an image of me at my high school graduation. I was standing on a grassy football field, wearing a blue cap and gown. The shadow stretching out across the grass behind me was massive, its long, shadowy fingers wrapping around the ankles of the other students standing nearby. I flipped to the next photo. It was a picture taken just a few months ago, showing me sitting alone in my cramped kitchen, looking exhausted. The deformed shadow was no longer just on the wall behind me. It was expanding, consuming the edges of the photograph, its dark mass slowly creeping toward my physical body in the image. I was standing in the cold, windowless basement, holding a stack of impossible photographs, realizing with absolute horror that I was trapped in a terrifying paradox. Rule number 3 explicitly stated that if I found a photograph of myself, I had to shred it immediately without breaking eye contact with the image. I needed to feed the photographs into the spinning blades right now, but the industrial shredder was jammed and completely stationary. In order to clear the jam and start the machine, I had to follow rule number 2. I had to unplug the power cord, turn my back on the machine, and face the concrete corner of the room. I could not obey Rule 3 because I had failed to obey Rule 2. I stared down at the top photograph of my childhood bedroom. As I watched the glossy surface, the dark ink making up the shadowy creature began to shift. The movement was incredibly subtle at first, just a slight rippling of the dark pigment. Then, the two-dimensional shadow turned its deformed head independently of the frozen image of my younger self. The faceless, jagged maw angled outward, looking directly up at me through the glossy paper. The entity was moving inside the flat space of the photograph. Simultaneously, the low, struggling electrical hum of the jammed shredder began to change. The mechanical buzzing deepened, adopting a heavy, rhythmic thumping sound that vibrated through the soles of my shoes. It sounded exactly like a massive, racing heartbeat echoing from the steel belly of the machine. The thick red fluid pooling in the hopper began to emit a powerful, overwhelming odor. It smelled sharply of raw copper and the metallic tang of ozone. The fluid started to bubble rapidly, spilling over the edge of the hopper and splashing onto the concrete floor. It stretched outward, moving against gravity, reaching across the dusty concrete like growing, pulsing veins, crawling slowly toward the toes of my heavy work boots. I noticed a sudden change in the lighting of the room. The single, harsh fluorescent tube mounted directly above my head began to flicker violently. With every rapid flash of darkness, the physical shadow I was casting against the concrete wall across the room changed its shape. My normal human silhouette grew larger, the arms elongated into impossible spider-like limbs. The head split open. My actual shadow was mimicking the monstrous shape trapped in the photographs. I remembered the strict containment protocol written in the red folder. I had to maintain unbroken eye contact with the entity, or it would detach from the surface and devour me. Rule 3 echoed the exact same command: shred the photographs immediately without breaking eye contact. I had to get the shredder running. I had to clear the jam while keeping my eyes locked onto the shifting, moving photograph in my left hand. I stepped closer to the massive steel machine. The liquid was scalding hot, burning the skin on my knuckles. It felt thick, muscular, and warm. It felt like plunging my hand into a pile of living, pulsing tissue. I gritted my teeth, ignoring the burning pain, and felt around the razor-sharp steel drums using only my sense of touch. I had to rely entirely on my peripheral vision to ensure my hand did not slip and slide directly into the cutting edge of the blades. Sweat poured down my forehead, stinging my eyes. The heartbeat thumping from the motor grew louder, faster, matching the panicked rhythm of my own chest. The red veins of fluid crawling across the floor began to wrap around the rubber soles of my boot, pulling tightly against my ankles. My blind fingers brushed against a solid, dense obstruction wedged deep between the two main grinding cylinders. I gripped the object firmly. It felt smooth, incredibly hard, and calcified. It felt exactly like a segment of a human femur bone. I wrapped my fingers around the hard mass, braced my boots against the side of the steel hopper, and pulled upward with every ounce of physical strength I possessed. The obstruction shifted, scraping loudly against the steel blades. and suddenly popped free from the gears. I pulled my hand out of the hopper, throwing the hard, calcified mass over my shoulder onto the concrete floor. The industrial shredder instantly roared back to life with a deafening metallic screech. The heavy steel drum spun rapidly, chewing through the remaining red fluid and sending a fine spray of hot red mist into the air. The sudden return of the deafening noise broke my concentration for a fraction of a second. My eyes darted away from the photograph in my hand. The fluorescent light above me shattered completely, raining sparks and powdered glass down onto my shoulders. The room plunged into deep, heavy shadows, illuminated only by the faint red glow of the machine's control panel. I looked up at the concrete wall. The towering, deformed shadow had detached from the floor, its physical weight pressed down on the entire room, compressing the air in my lungs and making it incredibly difficult to breathe. A wave of freezing cold washed over my skin as the massive, jagged maw descended from the ceiling, plunging toward my physical body. I snapped my head down, forcing my eyes back onto the stack of photographs in my left hand. I locked my vision onto the shifting shape inside the glossy paper, refusing to blink, forcing my eyes to stay open even as tears of pain and panic streamed down my cheeks. Following Rule 3 to the absolute letter, I thrust my left hand forward and shoved the entire stack of photographs directly into the spinning, roaring blades of the shredder. The steel teeth caught the glossy paper instantly, pulling the stack down into the grinding mechanism with a violent crunch. The moment the blades chewed through the first photograph, a wave of severe physical nausea slammed into my stomach. A sharp, blinding pain erupted in the back of my skull, feeling as though a long, hot needle was being driven directly into my brain. I dropped to my knees on the concrete floor, clutching my head with both hands, gasping for air as the machine continued to devour the images of my past. With every photograph that passed through the spinning blades, the crushing weight in the room lifted slightly. A loud, piercing shriek of pure agony echoed through the windowless basement, sounding like grinding metal and tearing meat. The sound did not come from the machine. It came from the towering shadow pressing against the walls. The shredder pulled the final photograph down into the hopper, grinding the glossy paper into a fine white dust. The agonizing shriek cut off abruptly, leaving only the steady, mechanical roar of the industrial machine. The sharp pain in my skull faded into a dull, throbbing ache. The nausea receded, allowing me to take a deep, full breath of the dusty air. I slowly opened my eyes and looked at the concrete wall. My shadow was back to normal, a standard human silhouette cast faintly by the red glow of the control panel. I looked down at my boots. The crawling veins of red fluid had completely dried up, turning into harmless, dark gray toner powder that crumbled away when I shifted my feet. I looked at my right hand. The scalding, pulsing tissue was gone, leaving my skin covered only in harmless, sticky red ink. The heavy, thumping heartbeat of the motor smoothed out, returning to a normal, mechanical purr. The conveyor belt rolled steadily. I sat on the cold concrete floor for the remainder of the night, staring blankly at the spinning blades. I did not touch another box. I did not move. I just listened to the hum of the machine and waited for the hours to pass. At exactly 8 in the morning, the heavy metal doors of the service elevator slid open. The supervisor, wearing the expensive tailored suit, walked into the room, holding a ceramic cup of coffee. He stopped a few feet away from me, his eyes scanning the concrete floor. He noticed the dried gray toner powder scattered around my boots, the shattered glass of the fluorescent bulb, and the red ink staining my right hand. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. "Good job," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. "I honestly did not think you were going to survive the night. The turnover rate for the midnight shift is incredibly high." I slowly pushed myself off the floor, my legs shaking slightly. I stared at him, my mind still reeling from the events of the night. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice hoarse and trembling. "What is that machine? What were those files?" The supervisor walked over to the control panel and pressed the red button, shutting down the roaring shredder. The sudden silence in the room was jarring. "We are a law firm," he said calmly, leaning against the side of the steel hopper. "But we do not represent human clients, and we do not practice standard corporate law. We defend baseline reality. Our world is constantly overlapping with other dimensions, places filled with entities that defy biological logic and physical laws. When those entities slip through and cause incidents, we document the events, contain the anomalies, and destroy the evidence." He patted the thick steel casing of the industrial shredder. "Human belief is a powerful anchor," he explained. "If people remember these creatures, if the concepts take root in the collective consciousness, the entities gain the ability to manifest permanently. In order to get rid of every memory in human minds, we use this machine. And I am sure you already noticed that it is not just a mechanical shredder. It is a contained, engineered entity designed to consume and erase conceptual anchors. When it shreds a file, the knowledge of that event is slowly scrubbed from reality." He looked at me, his smile fading into a serious, professional expression. "You are the first technician to survive the first shift in over a year," he said. "The previous employee broke rule number 4. He heard someone knocking on the heavy steel elevator doors at 3 in the morning, and he let the door knocker enter the room. We never found his body. You should be very proud of yourself for managing the jam successfully. Be ready. We have a massive backlog of files coming in tonight." I walked over to the small table in the corner and picked up my jacket. I wiped the dried red ink off my hand using a paper towel. I walked towards the service elevator, pressing the call button. I accepted the fact that I was going to return at midnight. I accepted that I needed the money, and that to keep this high-paying job, I would have to slowly feed the rest of my life into the roaring blades of the machine.